Good morning, everyone. My name is Carlos Castañeda, and I am a senior mental health clinician at Texas Tech Health Science Center, El Paso. We are under what's called the TCHAT program, where we assist many schools in West Texas area from elementary to high school in mental health services and continuity of care. And we'll certainly provide more information in the event that any school faculty member is interested in providing services for their students. So we are under the Division of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. My colleague, Melissa Carrasco Herrera, went ahead and collaborated with me on this presentation, so we worked together on developing this. If in the event that you ever have any questions, please feel free to email us at tchat.ep@ttuhsc.edu. And our number for our office is 915-215-6170. So for this presentation, we're going to be talking about grief and loss, especially due to the pandemic and COVID-19, and just so much loss has been being experienced by not just adults, but children as well. And there's a lot of grief that's been going on. So some faculty members and parents might ask, what exactly is grief? Grief is a natural instinctual reaction to the loss of someone or something that we hold attachment to. We're definitely going to jump on the something in a little bit, because a lot of people have the perception that it's just a person. We experience grief only when we lose a loved one. Grief is experienced differently by each person, but there are patterns that are generally noted among people in mourning. So some symptoms people with grief may experience include somatic or bodily distress. They may have preoccupation, and for this one, it means focusing on different tasks or objects or activities or schedules rather than focusing on the loss that they just experienced. It's a deflective, defensive mechanism that we're trying to do to protect ourselves from the harm of acknowledging that there is a loss in our family. That's an example of grief. Guilt, being guilty that we could have done more for that individual. We could have saved them in some way. Whether you're a health practitioner or a teacher, there's that feeling that you can have that this is your fault, when in reality it's not. Hostile reactions. So this is another type of defense mechanism where we may be deflecting our anger onto those who are less threatening. And so an example might be not yelling at your superiors per se, but taking out your emotional reactions that you're experiencing inside on a family member, on a pet, on a child, or a student. So these are some common examples. And then difficulty functioning as one did prior to loss. In the event that people are feeling lethargic, they don't feel like getting up, they don't feel like being motivated or being how they used to be before this loss happened. These are all examples of grief, and does not mean that you have to have one of these specifications in experiencing it. We all experience grief differently. So grief is also having deep sorry, especially that's caused by someone's death, and it's a natural response to losing someone or something that's important to you. So going into the something, we have before I could talk about this part, the types of losses, there are individuals who have a loss of material objects or relationships, and this can lead to, deep remorse. So especially when we have students, and I'll give the example here, loss of material objects with sentimental value. Well, I'm sure we all have a special object that, that has a memory tied to it. It could be a stuffed animal from when you were a child. It can be an engagement ring. It can be multiple things. So we have to try and make sure that we understand that children, especially if they're your own children or your students, if they have this type of hurt feeling or grief because of, say, their stuffed animal being destroyed, or their drawing, something that was very meaningful to them was lost, we acknowledge and we accept what they're going through, especially due to how we have this type of feelings as well. But we just tend to think, they're just a child, so these items maybe don't mean as much to them as, say, this wedding ring I have does. We have to make sure we provide empathy and putting ourselves in the child's footsteps and acknowledging that this was a loss to them and it's really hard for them, and we can try and help them understand what they're going through, which is grief, and how to heal. So then we also have the types of losses, which are loss of person due to death, A loss of relationship. This can be especially hard for adolescent population. So those who go may experience a breakup and not understanding what's going on. And developmentally, we are experiencing hormonal changes in the adolescent phase. So everything can feel extra complicated, extra challenging, and extra confusing for adolescent youth. So this can be acknowledged as a grief experience as well when there's a breakup in a relationship. We also have a divorce, and I'm pretty sure as faculty, you know that you see changes in students when their parents divorce, changes in behavior, their emotions or motivations. So this in itself is an example of a loss and how children and adolescents may express grief as well. Severe distancing, friendships, or family relationships. I'd like to include military families as well in the event that they move to another city or state due to being stationed somewhere else. Excuse me, this can be really challenging for the children and adolescent population to where they just created a deep friendship with a peer or multiple peers, and they just lost that really quickly. And this can be really challenging, and the type of behavior of not making too many close relationships can be adopted by this population if they frequently have to move. So just acknowledging that it's a loss, that they can being distanced from friends, and they can experience grief in that way as well. We just talked about material objects with sentimental value, and I want to talk about this one especially, the loss of ability to engage in meaningful rituals, especially those that cannot be postponed and honored at a later time. So due to COVID-19, we're on the second year almost of graduations maybe being postponed or canceled. We have funerals where family members can't pay their respects and sit in on the funeral. They have to do the drive-throughs. I've heard of different places doing that where you can only drive in your car and pass by the casket for the individual that you lost, which is terrible. We have weddings. Weddings have been canceled, postponed, or changed to where it might be used by Zoom. And though that's great, the experience is not the same. And there are people that want to attend this. In-person schooling. I know a lot of schools are starting to accommodate students now, which is great. But and I know students were very excited when COVID started that they had 2 weeks off. But the way that children learn is through play, and that's how they develop personalities and experiences through play and other means with peers. So the event that it's been almost or over a year now, and students still don't have that ability to be physically with them all the time can be really challenging for them and counts as a loss as well, loss in experience. So there's that grief part too. So there are a lot of rituals, religious rituals that are also being postponed or accommodated to being at home, and it can be really challenging for those who have a spiritual sentiment with tied into their lives, and COVID-19 has just altered it for them. So there's a lot of losses that's happened this past year now. There's also the loss of freedom. So even though we're at home and it's a safe place for us, or maybe it's not, but something that we have to acknowledge is being stuck in a location every day and not being able to go out too many times is considered a loss of freedom. And sometimes it can feel like a prison. And that's, I think, what gets people to where if they feel like they're confined in an area, not able to spread out, especially since, our ancestors are rather nomadic, or we traveled a lot or walked around a lot, it can be really difficult. So that counts as a loss as well. And people do experience grief, but maybe don't realize why they're feeling sad, when in reality, just being at home cooped up a lot can be a prime example or a reason. So for this one, this is a recording, but I want to make sure you take some reflection and think, have your families or children ever experienced grief recently? So maybe if you have time, being able to just take some time, five or 10 minutes, and think about it and reflect on it, or maybe even writing it down. I found that journaling has been very helpful for individuals who have not just grief, any situation that's relevant to mental health. And it's really beneficial. It can be really challenging to write the bad days, but I encourage it because it's your way of opening up and letting out what's going on with you, especially if you can't see a counselor. So just think about that. Have your families or children experienced grief recently? How did it make you feel? How did it make them feel? What are you doing now about it? And what are they doing about it? Feel free to pause this video if you want to take reflection. And we're going to go ahead and move on. So the stages of grief may not occur in order, and they vary from person to person. Sometimes we see in the TV shows or the cartoons that an example of somebody losing something and they just name the stages and then the character quickly goes through each stage while they're naming them. It doesn't exactly happen like that, but people may move on and in and out of the stages at different times throughout the grieving process. So an example is you could go back into the grief or guilt part and progress, but then take another step back. These instances happen. And I do like to say and mention that grief is normal. We are supposed to experience grief. It's part of our, human instincts, the human process. We are human, just to remind ourselves that sometimes. And it's just important that we do this because if we continue to store and not process and let out our emotions, I like to explain it to my clients as if they are pouring stuff in a bottle. And eventually that bottle is going to overfill. And then I ask them, what happens if you try to put the cap on a bottle that's still filling up? Some will say it'll explode. Some will say it overflows. So we have to make sure that we take this time to let ourselves experience grief. So going to the stages, we have denial and isolation. So that includes blocking out words and facts, denying the reality of the situation. I haven't had that experience really, but I've heard of cases from colleagues where clients just say, no, they're on vacation, or a child saying, no, my dad, he's just asleep. There's nothing wrong. He's fine. So this can happen in children, adolescents, as well as adults too. Anger. This may be directed toward the deceased, towards the family, or to the strangers. Sometimes individuals might be angry, even though they're not thinking per se. I like to call anger as the mask, and under the mask is the true emotion of pain, most likely. So the anger might be at the deceased toward, why didn't you fight harder? It might be towards family members. We could have done so much more for them. For strangers, this is their fault for hurting my family member. Toward your deity, sometimes people are angry and they ask, why God? Why did you do this to me? Or why to their, their deep respective deity? So these are examples of anger. And then there's also the bargaining phase or stage. And this is the if only statements. This ties into the guilt that I mentioned previously. But when we feel that if only I just took them to the doctor sooner, if only I washed my hands, maybe they wouldn't have gotten COVID. And we don't even know in these if only statements if we are the reason for the loss. Most to all the times, we're not. But that bargaining part is just putting so much guilt and extra pain on yourself. We also have the depression, which is the sadness and regret stage. So this one, we have a quiet preparation to bid farewell to the deceased. It's where we're starting to reach the acceptance stage, but we're not quite there yet. It's where we take the time to really feel hurt, sad. We regret maybe the time that we didn't spend enough time with them. Excuse me. We wish we could have been with our family more. We just experience pure sadness. And then we reach the acceptance stage, which is rather difficult. Not everyone may reach this stage, and it's about making peace with themselves and the deceased. Sometimes people have a really hard time with this. They may have that acknowledgement that their significant person in their life is deceased, but there's not the peace. And maybe they could, and this is where the going back goes into, where they're still briefly or quietly mentioning the if only part, the bargaining stage. They could still briefly have anger and they can still feel depressed. So usually at least what I've been taught in the mental health field, we've been told that when somebody experiences a loss from a family member, let's give them some time to be able to process their grief. And then in the event that in that time, they still aren't, they're going back and forth in their stages, or their physical and mental health are being threatened by this, then that's where we have to jump in and provide that help to try and maybe reach that acceptance of making peace with ourselves and the disease. it can be really hard because depending on the person who passed away, it can be they were our anchor to our lives, and then now they're our anchor to not being able to move on. And what's funny is we're the one that's holding the anchor. It's not them, it's ourselves. So, for the grief experience, grief is a complex experience involving feelings and bodily sensations. There's no set limit or time limit for the duration of your grief. So, I know like some individuals that had a family member pass away, they told me, it took me like 6 months for me to actually feel it and cry and mourn. And I asked them, why did they suspect that? And they think because of just the way that how they were raised, to where to be a man, to be a Hispanic male, they couldn't grieve and they had to be tough. So being tough, they thought they were okay and they thought they were doing fine. And then it just took one small thing that was a reminder and that allowed them to let everything out. And it felt great at that moment, but they still realized they had a long way to go to actually let grief out. But then they learned too that they didn't need to do that. They didn't need to hold it in for so long and let their bottles explode, as I previously mentioned. One can expect to experience more intense grief throughout the first year, and over time, it can fade. I remember when I experienced a significant loss in my life, my licensed professional counselor supervisor had talked to me about it. And he said, grief is a hole, or when we lose somebody, there's a hole missing in our heart, and it can be really big. And over time, the hole will get smaller. It'll get smaller and smaller, but it never goes away. It's never completely gone, but it can be small enough to where it doesn't hurt as much when you think of that person you lost. And you may be even replaced with a brief sadness, but also some happiness of the memories that you experience. So that's something that I try to work with individuals who lose and someone who's significant in their lives, that they have that hole in their heart or inside them. And just in time, it will get smaller and smaller and it'll hurt less and less. There's no right or wrong journey through grief, though we have the stages and we talked about going back and forth. Everybody experiences it differently. And we want to make sure that we provide the respect to and empathy to provide that care. I know sometimes, especially faculty members and parents, they will try and tell students, hey, cheer up, it's okay, we can do this together. But sometimes we just need to let them experience that grief and ask them, would you like me just to sit with you and be here with quiet while you let out your emotions, or we just sit here together? And sometimes that's all the student needs. Sometimes they just need someone to be in their presence, to understand them, and not try to make things feel better because maybe they don't want that right now. Maybe that's their body saying, I need to grieve. And grief doesn't happen in neat stages or well-defined phrases, nor is it linear. So, I like to think of it as the stock market, where it'll go up and down, but my hope is with a healthy individual that it will eventually progress. But I understand that there are going to be these loops and spikes. There's also unresolved grief, which is also known as complicated grief, that becomes problematic and interferes with one's ability to engage in life. That can be a cause for concern. So I think we talked briefly about one of the symptoms and how some people might feel, lethargic, not wanting to go to work, not wanting to get up. This is why typically we might give individuals some time off. And this is why if it's continuous, even after say a week or two off, that's where we have that concern and we ask them to go see somebody who can be there for them. In the event that somebody is also not eating, we want to make sure that they're being fed and they can try and eat. And actually, something that I recently learned about grief is that's why people bring food to you or you eat after a funeral, because food does provide, dopamine. Our body provides dopamine for positive things to help us continue to live and reinforce those behaviors. So our brain will give us dopamine if we take a bite to eat. And when we have funerals, we tend to try and celebrate the lives of the individual. And we also usually have food there. So that's why there's typically that. That's also why when there's a loss, neighbors or family members might bring you food to put in your fridge to eat for later, because you're not going to have that time likely or want to cook for yourself. You're not going to maybe want to take care of yourself. And that's why that community or family members in your life are trying to support you to make sure that you are fed and that you are being taken care of. Because sometimes grief can be really powerful and prevent us from taking care of ourselves. Excuse me. Therapy can help with normal grief as well as complicated grief, you know, especially for the complicated grief, but it's also there for the normal should an individual need it. And I like to make sure that if a client talks with me about it, and I've asked if they've had time to really go through it on their own and just ask how it's been for them, how they've survived it. And if I see that, I would ask them, do they need more time to process it on their own before seeing me, or would they like me to facilitate it with them together? Because sometimes people don't know because due to culture or the way that their family has shared how to experience grief, it could be different. And they may or may not like that process. So now we're gonna be talking about coping with grief. We have a difference in healthy and unhealthy ways. And the healthy way is accepting the reality of the loss. We can't do this the first day or second day. It can be really challenging. We see that the person passed away, but the true acceptance of someone is lost and making peace, that can be a rough road. And we want to make sure that that's an overall goal when somebody has grief. Acknowledging and allowing space for pain. This is a time where we try and not to make the person feel better unless they want to. So as I mentioned, sitting with that person in silence, asking them if they need a hug or if they need to be held. If they need anything that can help them just let out their pain, or even being a listener, not providing solutions, not telling them how they can feel better, but just listening. And they didn't know that this is really hard what they're going through. And sometimes there are people who have experienced the same type of loss. So they might come to you for that help. If a student knows that you lost a family member due to COVID and that just happened with them, they might want to know, how are you doing? How have you survived this? How have you gotten better? And that's the part where we need to try. And even though we've experienced our hardships, we acknowledge that, they've experienced pain and this is what you're trying to do to cope. If we just try to tell them, I'm fine, I'm actually so well, so like I'm doing okay, I really am, even though I lost my family member, our student might perceive that as, well, I can never reach that. I'm really hurt right now, and just feel even more pain. So we want to be careful. We want to be real with especially adolescent students who are still learning who they are as a person, their identity phase, and how to experience emotions. A goal is also adjusting to life after the loss. We have a lot of individuals who, as a mental health clinician, somebody comes to see me, there's a high chance that it's not per se a depression diagnosis that they need, but a adjustment disorder that they may need instead. And for that one, it's adjusting to life's challenges, whether they're moving, they lost a family member, and that's why they're experiencing these negative symptoms, or just other factors. Excuse me. Finding ways to remember what was lost while still moving forward. This is where I mentioned about the whole part, where we remember and we acknowledge the person we lost, and we feel slight pain. That's understandable. We also have the happy memories, and we rely on those to make us continue to engage positively in our lives and just being able to live with a smile rather than a cloud over our heads, as I tell for my kiddos. Some examples of unhealthy coping skills include denying that the losses occurred or that it ever happened or that it made an impact, engaging in activities that distract them from feeling, or using substances to numb the pain. This can be especially challenging for adolescents who might be using those substances to just try and reduce any pain that they're feeling and blocking it, if anything. And this can be accessible through parents who might be going through something similar. Actually, they're using alcohol, or they could be using drugs, or any different things, factors. And other ways that people try to neglect their pain are by doing what I like to call it's similar to what people call as a midlife crisis, but I'm not calling it that. It's to where they have the experience or the need to live and try different things. And this could be good. However, if it's in the event that it's hurting you financially or it becomes riskier than it should be, those are examples of distracting from the feeling of pain. Refusing to make any changes, that can be something as well, to where the individual who's staying in these unhealthy coping skills and not wanting to change in any way, that can be very, very damaging. And this is why when people come to talk with us, I like to say thank you for taking the first step in investing in your mental health, because generally it's up to that individual to want to change. And I can be the best therapist in the world, but if they are not willing to change, nothing would be beneficial for them. So we want to make sure that we provide that support to help change that mindset, that they can make this change and it is better for them than what they're doing now. Avoiding all reminders of what was lost or staying stuck in loss. So I want to read that one again for everybody. Avoiding all reminders of what was lost or staying stuck in the loss. Sometimes we might have family members who hide the pictures of the individuals they lost. They might try and not even want you to mention somebody's name that was lost. And it's because they don't want to experience that pain. It's one way of just distracting and blocking the idea, the reality that that person is gone. So we have to make sure that we help them acknowledge a reality in some safe way, especially since they're in a very fragile state. Coping with grief. Some other factors include, and these are more of the positive side, sending cards or flowers. For children and adolescents, I think it's very important for them to be able to express what they're feeling to that person. And sending a card and writing what they're feeling can be very beneficial. If they have the flowers and they're able to take the flowers and just talk with the person who might be in their respective grave area or area that they're in rest, that's something that can be beneficial as well. Someone told me that the grave, the funeral areas are not for the dead, but for us to be able to cope and speak with them. So I think it's very beneficial if the individuals could just have that time to talk or write what's going on and how they're feeling. And overall can help change to a more positive tone to where they're talking about their day, how they're doing, and they're experiencing the way to where they're able to talk to that family member per se. Um, Kind of like a journal entry almost. Preparing food. We talked about how food can be very healthy and very beneficial for our dopamine spikes when we experience loss. So for this one, being able to cook food is a very great coping skill because we want to make sure that we can do tasks that help us feel good, that we can accomplish. So something that I tell children and adolescents, especially if they are experiencing depression or loss or grief from loss, I tell them, I promise your parent or guardian, they did not pay me to tell you this, but let's try making our bed. And I ask them to go ahead and just make their bed real quick and how they feel. And they say they feel fine, but I ask them to try and do that every day. And then the reason why is because when we're able to make small accomplishments in our controlled areas, we feel good. We get that, dopamine or endorphin spike, and it makes us want to continue to feel motivated and continue to reach more accomplishments that might be more challenging. So if we made our bed and then we decided to cook some food and we decided to write a card, we decide to work out that day. These are all examples in how we can continue to feel good and have that positive experience. Providing childcare. So this would be more for adults, but those who are spending time with their with their families and their children could be very beneficial because we might want to feel isolated or alone at times when we're grieving. The household chores I just mentioned, it continues to have a snowball effect basically of feeling good and doing those little chores and makes you feel more motivated and successful. Offering transportation. This one, if you are a faculty member who maybe post-COVID typically drives a team for a UIL event or a sports event, doing that or picking up coworkers and going to work together, that has an positive effect too, because it's kind of making you sit with somebody and talking. And it doesn't have to be about the grief, but as I mentioned before, we can isolate ourselves and not want to talk with individuals. But being able to do that just really helps us to where we're able to talk to somebody. And if you're offering the transportation, you're helping somebody. And that's kind of like the chores we just talked about. So where if you're providing help towards someone else, we kind of have that good feeling about ourselves as well, because we accomplished something by helping a fellow human. The last one is be available. Grieving people don't want you to talk, just to listen. So this is one we've talked about already, but being able to sit with that person who's grieving. I only imagine the only time they'd want you to talk is if you went through the exact same experience as them. But yeah, sometimes they might ask you, why are you quiet? And because usually people might be trying to tell them solutions all the time. You can just say, I think you just need me to listen, and I can do that for you if you want me to. And then if they want to be alone, let them be alone, of course. But if they are, especially if it's in the school and that's more challenging, just let them know, hey, there's an area if you'd like to go rest in the corner. I have a beanbag chair for you. Go ahead and take some time, 5 or 10 minutes or as much time as you need, then come back and we can go back on that assignment together. Or, just providing those, especially if you understand or know what's going on, that they've lost a family member. So other ways to process grief include creating a special place in your home to honor the loss. I'd like to make sure that this is a beautiful, decorated area and a team effort. So if there's a family that lost one family member, having the whole family participate in decorating it, making it look beautiful to where everybody put a part of themselves into it and making sure that it's well maintained. Engaging in a special ritual to honor the loss. Sometimes people have different religious events like Dia de los Muertos. Others might write letters to the lost or visit and on holidays or once a week or go to church and pray for them. So just making sure we remind them like, hey, if you have a spiritual or a religious aspect in your life, what is it? And then just say, oh, do you all practice this? This typically ties in celebrating the ones we've lost. And I'm wondering if that's something you'd like to do. And just asking and not suggesting it or implement or forcing it on them, but just offering it as a potential solution if they ask for it or if the parents ask for it, especially. Write a letter you don't send. So this one you can put into a box until you're ready to let go of them. Some people burn it, but I wouldn't recommend that for students, especially with fire. So, if it's more for faculty or adults, you can do that as well. Just make sure you're in a safe area. But also just storing it and not sending it to anybody. But as I mentioned before, writing can be very beneficial. So being able to write down everything that you're feeling and then keeping it locked or destroying it in the future. Journaling about your feelings, the things you miss, the memories, or simply free write. So professor that I actually got to learn from in undergrad, his name is Dr. James Pennybaker. He wrote a book called Opening Up and how he researched individuals who write from their traumatic experiences. And he found those who wrote down their trauma had a really hard time at first. They experienced so much more pain than those who went to therapy. But in the end, after I'd say a couple of months, he noticed that they were mentally, when they did the wellness checks, they were doing so well. They had major improvements compared to those who were just going to counseling. And counseling's still good. I'll let you all know that. But he found that there was that dip due to writing the pain and what they're feeling. And then after that, kind of feeling more liberated, kind of feeling close to being healed. So that's something that we want to talk about in grief. Whether you're writing about it or talking about it, you are going to have those dips, and that's okay. That's understandable, and it's supposed to happen. Lastly, be mindful about your grief experience and intentional about when you make space for it. So we mentioned it before and how you can help, but allowing the grieving person full range of emotions, being patient and understanding, telling them that it's okay to talk about the memories of the deceased, positive or negative, and remembering that grieving takes time. So then we're briefly going to talk about abnormal bereavement. and how it's less likely to use, people might feel less likely to use health services. And it's important to have that outreach effort for those who experience severe grief or complicated grief, as we mentioned before. This might lead to depression, it might lead to suicide, it might lead to anxiety that they might be the next ones to get hurt or die. Suicide because life isn't worth it anymore since the person in their life is gone. For this one, I try to tell my clients, I understand that you're trying not to kill yourself because that person in your life isn't, they wouldn't want that. That person in life is significant. You don't want to disappoint them. But I want you to live for you and not live for someone else. And then having the symptoms or the depression diagnosis to where you're feeling like a weighted blanket is on you, and it's just too hard to be able to push it off and get up and have continue on because of what happened from loss. So for this one, we're going to be talking about a grounding exercise. For grounding, this simply means being able to be in touch with reality and kind of feeling what's going on in the sensations around us. Sometimes when we have a lot of anxiety or negative thoughts, anxiety are thoughts of what can happen in the future that might not happen, and depression are thoughts about the past. And rarely it's hard to think in the present. So for this one, I invite you to participate in this with me. And it's something that you can try and use for your students and being mindful and just grounding themselves. So for this one, just go ahead and lead on to where just have everybody close their eyes. And if you're doing this online, you can say, you don't have to close your eyes. You can just look down away from the screen. And I want you to take a deep breath, breathing in like you're smelling a birthday cake, and breathe out like you're blowing out the candles. Breathe in and breathe out. Telling your kiddos that I want you to try and put your toes on the floor and just feel the ground. You might have your shoes on, you might not. Just notice how it feels. If it's soft, it's rough. And then we go up toward our legs. Notice how they are feeling. Are they heavy? Are they warm? Are they light? Are they shaking or are they still? I'm just taking a deep breath. Sometimes we might be thinking about other things or other people, and that's okay. We don't need to judge ourselves. We just need to gently guide ourselves back to how we're currently feeling. It's normal to have thoughts of other things or other people. And take your deep breath in and deep breath out. Now go toward your arms and just get a sense of how they feel. Are your hands clenched? Are you messing with your fingers? Do your arms feel tight? Are they warm or cold? Are they soft or rough? Just take a notice on how they feel. Next, I want you to try and focus on your core, where your chest and stomach area are. Is your chest tight or your stomach tight? Are you leaning forward or backward? Do your muscles feel tight in your stomach? Do you feel warm or cold? Is your heart beating fast or slow? Next, I want you to try and focus on your neck. Is your neck hanging? Is it relaxed or stiff? Is it warm or cold? And take a deep breath in and a deep breath out. Now I want you to go up into your head and feel how your face feels. Is your jaw clenched? Are your eyes tightening or loose? Is your head up, down, warm or cold? Now that we kind of acknowledged how we felt, I want you to try and just let every part of your body relax. So let your legs and feet just feel less tight. Let them relax. Let go of any tension in your fingers. Just let them lay there. Unclench your jaw. Maybe take your deep breath and let your stomach just expand and not feel tight. Maybe lean back into your chair. Just let your neck and head rest. Let your shoulders down too. Notice how they feel now compared to how they did before, and how great that you might be feeling. And there might be times where you're not feeling better, and that's okay. And when you're ready, I want you to take a deep breath in. Give yourself a positive affirmation. And that means a positive statement like, I'm a good person, I am safe, I am loved. And take a deep breath out. And when you're ready, blink your eyes open. Welcome back. Thank you for practicing that with me. Sometimes we experience raw emotions from exercises like this as well. So if you're feeling more vulnerable, that's okay, and that's understandable. But just wanted to give you the heads up. And thank you for practicing that exercise with me. So here we have what's called the TChat barcode and website. If you have the PowerPoint, you're able to click on the TChat letters and it'll take you to the website. If not, you can pause and put your camera phone on this QR code and it'll take you to our website on your phone. And what this does is it just has our information on how we can provide mental health services for children and adolescents in your school district, and also some resources. So we have examples of depression, autism, grief and loss, suicidality. We have a lot of information and resources per those respected fields, and we do not mind sharing them with the community. Excuse me, we also provide presentations for different school districts. So if you're interested in having that for your faculty or family members, please feel free to let us know, and we're happy to do that and volunteer these services for you all. We're an organization through the university that's provided funding by the state. So our services are at no charge to the schools, no charge to the students, no charge to the faculty. We also have another program called CPAN, and that's Child Psychiatry Access Network. And for this one, we're assisting more of the pediatricians of our children and adolescents. So sometimes there's a mental health concern and a child needs medication. Sometimes pediatricians might not feel comfortable in prescribing medications, so they will refer them to a psychiatrist. The problem is we're very limited in Texas with the amount of psychiatrists we have. So this program is to provide it to where the pediatrician can call our clinics, and one of our psychiatrists can provide recommendations on what they can prescribe, and that's free to the clinics as well. So if we have a TChat client and then we give them medication, we let their respected physician know, and then we can provide any recommendations when our services are over. So the pediatrician can continue to contact us for free and receive any help if they have any questions about psychotropic medications. Lastly, we have our crisis numbers, and we have the EHN crisis line, the toll-free crisis line, the crisis text line, National Suicide Prevention Hotline, and Center Against Sexual and Family Violence Hope Line. Please feel free to pause this and save these numbers if you ever need them, but they are definitely there, and if you think your students need them or family members, please feel free to share this as well. And we also ask that, especially if it's one of your students, that you abide by your school district's respective rules in how to manage a student who is experiencing suicidal ideations or intentions. Resources. So there are some apps out there that can be used for students, and there's so many now. So these are just very limited examples, but there's the Stop, Think, Breathe Headspace app, and I believe they provide discounts for nurses. I'm not sure about teachers anymore, but I hope they do. And then the relaxation room. And for this one, I believe it's like a online relaxation room if you wanted to put it on your screen. But yeah, and that's it. Thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciated it and all of your participation. And we look forward to working with you. If you ever need us, please feel free to contact us if you ever have any questions or concerns.